I usually start these artist talks by saying something like, so what are we looking at, right? Which is a silly question, but obviously the question at hand. But with you, I want to start slightly differently, and I want to ask you why these are still paintings at this point, given everything you do to them, besides the paint.
Well, I would say that they're still paintings because they basically start with the major elements of what a painting is. So basically you just have your stretcher bars, you have a canvas, and paint. So
And
at
then,
a very basic
so
level.
what happened?
Yeah, so when I was still in school, I wanted to figure out a new way. Obviously I wanted to do something original and come up with an idea that hadn't been done before. And I came up with the idea of hand weaving a canvas, because I didn't want to use a machine-made canvas. And the original works were sort of woven out of jute or twine and then painted like a monochrome color. So the idea was that you read across the surface of the painting by what was underneath it rather than what was on top. And the other thing that sort of interested me at the time was this kind of inversion of surface and support, because I sort of did these weavings, painted them, and then cut them out of the frames. So really, the paint acted like a glue that held the thing together. And again, you sort of read across the surface.
It's so
based on the
interesting.
weaving underneath it.
Did you think at the time this was happening about a relationship with that moment's kind of upsurge in interest in textile art, or was that not part of your thinking?
No, well, I think I was looking a lot at I guess stain painters at the time.
Okay.
So like Morris Lewis or Helen Frankenthal, I was sort of intrigued by this idea of the surface and the object merging together. So since that had sort of been explored, I just sort of thought, well, I'm going to sort of take that one step further.
And I think that there's a lot of art that has attempted to have that conversation, but sort of like using the same language, right? Some illusion, oftentimes something like destruction or violence, so that you are reminded viscerally that it's an object and not just an image, but they do that. But this is, I love that it's about the building up. So you did that, but obviously all the evolution happened in between.
Yes.
And now looking at this work, the supports are integral to it, and in fact, double. And so this work has heft.
Yes.
This is like almost sculptural in a sense. And yet, to your point, I'm still kind of basically looking at paint on fabric. Basically.
Yeah.
Which is a really fun little, kind of language game to play.
Yeah.
So do you feel like was that path linear? In other words, from there to this, that evolution, it obviously seems like in this work you're still having that conversation with yourself. Have you continued having it since then, or did you kind of go away and come back to it, or how did it, from what you're describing as such a beautiful gestural, but also maybe kind of, I don't want to say ethereal, but vulnerable in that the paint holding the fabric together and that whole, this is sturdy. This is built to last. This is like a house.
So I would probably say the last sort of body of work that I did were these freestanding sculptures. And I was sort of thinking about this sort of weaving and painting in terms of the building technique of wattle and daub. If you guys are familiar with that, but basically...
No, I'm actually not, so I can't be the only one. So give it a parenthetical.
Yeah, so wattle and daub is a process of building structures. It was sort of this prehistoric notion where you basically weave willow branches and then you apply the mud to it, basically. So these were structures for houses. So the last body of work I did were these it was still this concept of a painting, but the more sort of wire shells that I was using was this idea of the stretcher or the frame was taken off the wall and was sort of its own little thing. These pieces sort of evolved out of that, because by putting it on the wall and doing this double stretcher, it sort of allowed me to have both those concepts, where you could have these very sort of thick, very sort of structural pieces that have a lot of presence, but there's a lot of space within them, which a lot of negative space, and a lot of these pieces play with different kind of concepts of negative space.
And not only with recognizable sort of industrial materials like these nylon ropes, that I would imagine are tensile strength, imparting sort of load bearing in a way. But then these sort of like, could be your childhood sheets or, right? That might actually carry meaning because they look really salvaged and organic and like, they were from like the house or something. And so as you're moving through leaving more and more of this kind of stuff visible, how are you making these choices? And
it just becomes a matter of building up a certain density. So, the nice thing about weaving is that it can act as line, it can act as composition, but then when you build up enough of this stuff, it does become surface. It becomes solid to a certain extent, to which then you can do something else to it. So, paint on it. So
I love that. And so then as these kinds of hollows and protrusions start to get formed, is that, and you don't have to give up all your secrets, although, as I mentioned earlier, the press release is an instruction manual, which is both like super divulging and also not at all helpful.
Right.
Just to anyone who wanted to try to do it. But, it's sort of like build this up. So are these sort of like, these are then kind of separate pieces that are kind of fitted.
Yes. One of the things that was important to me with this work was I wanted to sort of play upon this sculptural concept of it, but I didn't want to add something to the surface. I wanted to add something in the surface. And so I wanted to put these things inside the piece rather than sort of on top of it.
And this color is a lighter shade, but it's a very iconic LA color, the pink, and I definitely, now that I'm so in other words, if I have like a pareidolia or I see a kind of image in there, there's a permission structure where I'm allowed to see that because it's not there. More than most other paintings, certainly, you are really rewarded for moving your body around, away, and up close on these works. And it's not just like that cute, precious thing that like smart-looking art people do in museums where they get up close and then they step back to kind of like make sure. This is like you have to do that. Right? You are missing most of the point. If you only engage with these works head on. I guess like as you're thinking about it, are the color schemes as intuitive as the weaving materials are that you described as kind of having your pieces and working through it? When it's time to apply the paint, plaster, adobe, construction materials, to create what is actually the surface, is it intuitive? I mean, you said you respond a little bit to what has happened with the weaving, but also these elements are clearly labor intensive as well.
Sometimes it takes a while to figure out which colors will sort of resonate with other colors because it's important to me that the work, has a certain kind of feeling to it, to where there's like where it all sort of works together, and whether tones are sort of light or heavy, and basically like that's I want a certain resonance to the work, and so I'll sort of play with it in Photoshop. Get to a point where it's sort of like the last part to finish it. So the last thing on this would be this sort of like maroonish color, and then these shapes, these almost sort of floral shapes, or like botanical shapes.
Definitely.
And so I'll sort of have it up on my computer, and this whole area will just be blank, and then I'll just start playing with it.
Painting nature, you're taking these moments of enacting it, or you're not depicting architecture, you're building something.
Right. So, and you had mentioned like a lot of artists that do material in process. Like this was an element of process in the work. So it's just like that I didn't really have complete control over, or I just sort of let it kind of do it. I let the sun do its thing.
But that's, right, exactly, but that's only part of it.
Exactly.
That's not the point of it.
Right.
Because there is an aspect of let's just see what happens, which I think is a great energy that people would respond to, right? There's a lot of energy in that, like, let's just see.
Yeah.
But then there's like a painter who has ideas, and not necessarily like ego, but this idea that you want it to be the way you want it to be. And so there's a kind of collaboration with the laws of physics that happen. It's not, it doesn't look like tightly controlled work, but you keep, just because you can't see the control, it's like, no, there's intentionality in here. And I think there's one of the many pushes and pulls that goes on is that's what I'm sort of feeling like that. There's only 2 or 3 colors in that one. That's quite reserved.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. There's the brown, it feels like wood, it feels like bark, I'm not imagining it. The silhouettes are almost like a drawing of a tree, but like maybe, and then you're like, oh, maybe it isn't that, but in your mind, you know. And then some of them are these absolute riots instead. Yeah. And I love the variation, like it's such a specific technique, and yet the variation between each work is immeasurable. And so that's interesting too. Yeah. When you have something you do that's so specific. You know, I don't go around wanting to touch every piece of art I see. But there's something that really drags, you know, more than one sense into the work. And it kind of drags your body into it, and you want to reach out for it in the same way you might want to reach out for a particularly compellingly knotted tree trunk or something like, or the side of a stucco house, or the things that your body tells you to touch.
I remember like being in school, sort of the very beginning of the sort of PC computer flat screen age, and it just seemed like the flat image that's the computer, like that's your phone. So really the only way to sort of move forward with painting was to make it tactile and to make it have a physical presence, where you actually have to be in the presence of the work rather than